If you have ever had the opportunity to learn from me personally, you have already heard me talk about the 3 pillars of fence that every fencer must master if they're going to become a great swordsman. Those pillars are sword work, balance, and footwork. Now, if you think about each of those pillars as being built as a stack of bricks, if you will, right? Each one of those bricks represents a different skill inside each of those pillars. For example, if we're talking about the pillar of sword work, we're going to say that each one of the parries that you do, the exact precision, the technique, the timing, all of that is a skill for each of those parries. How you thrust is another skill for that particular pillar of sword work. Same thing with the balance, and in particular, and oftentimes neglected, is that pillar of footwork. And today I'm going to talk to you about a very important skill set that makes up the pillar of footwork, and that is the use of ground. When it comes to the use of ground in an indoor tournament, not a whole lot changes. Now, you might have a little bit of difference in terms of whether or not you are fencing on a court floor like a basketball court or whether you are fencing on a carpeted floor. But regardless of the case, if you're at an indoor tournament, let's say at a HEMA tournament somewhere, for example, the first thing you need to make sure that you do before the tournament begins is you need to walk the field. You need to go out there and you need to know what the width is just at a glance. I want you to stand at one edge of whatever the arena is that you're going to be fencing in. Sometimes that is a plastic tubing that I have seen sometimes where they tape it into place and that marks the boundaries of where you're going to be fencing. Sometimes it's just simply tape on the floor. Whatever the case is, you need to make sure that you walk it so that way you know exactly how many strides across it is. So that way when you're actually fencing and you're wherever you are in the middle of that particular bout, just by what is in front of you, you know how much distance remains behind you and you don't have to really think about it any more than that because you've already got that knowledge. Secondly, you need to make sure that you know the hazards of the field. Now, maybe that includes, as I had mentioned, the plastic tubing that gets taped down on the floor. I have seen people, fencers, in the middle of their bout as they are being pushed out of the boundaries, their ankle rolls as they hit that because of the fact that it causes them to have unstable footing. You want to know exactly what those hazards are in the vicinity so that way you can make sure to accommodate for that fact when you're in the midst of the fencing bout. And lastly, make sure that you test the traction. You're going to have different traction if you're on a court floor versus whether or not you are on a brick floor versus whether or not you are on a carpeted floor. You need to make sure that you understand how much traction you have, because believe me, that is going to affect your ability to strike your opponent in what particular time and exactly how quickly you can do that. So remember, always step out there, walk that field so you can get all of that knowledge and make sure that you are fully armed when you step out there for the first time. Now that we've talked about the indoor tournament perspective, let's talk about really what the use of ground means if you are fencing in an outdoor tournament, or if you happen to be, for example, if you're like me, you like to fence in other venues such as the SCA, and they have multiple battles out there where you've got anywhere from dozens to hundreds of opponents on one side of an army and dozens to hundreds on another side of the army. And you could be fencing in a forest, you could be fencing in an open field, whatever the case is. The ground has a tendency to throw you some curveballs once in a while. So let's talk about that for a moment. Just as I had mentioned when you were going to an indoor tournament, the first rule that you have when you go out there before the battle begins is that you make sure that you walk the field. This is important because not so much about knowing the width of the area that you're going to be fencing in, because unless it's an outdoor tournament perspective, you've got a whole lot of room that you're going to be moving in. Just as an example, I have fought in forest battles. I have fought in open field battles. It is important that you go out there and know where the potholes are. Are there potholes at all? Is the ground rough? Is it smooth? Is the grass wet? Is it dry grass? Know what your traction is while you're out there so that way you have an understanding without having to think about it any further as to exactly what limitations and what are the expectations that you have of that particular field. If you have that knowledge at your disposal and your opponent or opponents, as the case may be, do not, that is one more advantage that you have working for you. So I've talked to you about the importance of walking the ground in an outdoor scenario in order to preserve your own safety. You want to make sure that you're fencing as safely as you possibly can. Now let's talk about, however, the way that you can use ground as an actual weapon against your opponents. Now, if you've ever fenced in the SCA like I have, you've probably participated in a battle scenario where there are dozens to hundreds of people per side whose sole goal when they come together is to wipe each other out. I've participated in open field battles, which are a lot of fun, but I gotta say, my favorite scenario to fence in is during the forest battles. Now, as you might already have concluded, the forest is going to offer you quite a number of variables that you're going to be able to utilize and have to accommodate for while you're out there fencing. The ground is going to be uneven in many places. You might have obstacles like boulders in the way, tree roots sticking up out of the ground. The trees themselves standing up out of the ground are going to be obstacles, obviously. It not just offers you cover and concealment, but you can also use this terrain as an actual weapon against your opponents. One very simple way you can do that. If you are fencing against someone, and as you have probably seen before, as one person moves, the other moves, each one is adjusting and changing things according to what their opponent presents. Well, I will maneuver my opponent to a position where they touch up against something like, for example, a standing tree. When they do that, the moment that they touch that, you can see it in their eyes, you can see it in the body language that some of their conscious thought has now been redirected to what is that behind me. During that split second of time, that is when you make your attack against them. I'm telling you, their defenses have gone down, and you will be surprised at what was normally a very strong defense is now almost frozen in ice, because for that split second, they're thinking about what's behind them, not what's in front of them. And let's not forget too, there's going to be the factors of maybe that person fell off balance a little bit as they tried to readjust because of the fact that they touched something. The bottom line is, the moment they touch that object, their defenses will lower, and you need to take your shot then. Another way that you can use the forest and all of the obstacles therein to your advantage is that an engaged opponent is really easy to sneak up on when there are trees and rough ground and the sound of leaves on the ground and people are fighting and you hear a lot of the shouting. When your opponent that you're coming up on is already engaged with another person, let's say, for example, and I've done this plenty of times, I have seen an opposing swordsman on the opposing army engaging one of my fellows on my side. Well, because of the fact that they're so laser focused on the person in front of them, it was relatively easy for me to flank that person, walk up and commit to a death from behind, and that person never even saw me until it was too late. Now, I will say this. If you're ever in the situation where you are the one who is currently engaging that opposing swordsman and you see your friend is trying to sneak up on them, don't give it away. And I know you're probably not trying to do so, but I have seen this happen so many times. But let's say, for example, I was that person who was engaging the opposing swordsman and my fellow is trying to sneak up on them. Well, they'll be looking at that person while they're fencing, and all of a sudden they glance over their shoulder, and you totally give it away when you do that. So make sure that if your friend is about to sneak up and dispatch your opponent in front of you, make sure you don't give it away by looking over your shoulder and staring at the guy, because even for just a moment, and I understand it is an instinct, but don't do it because you're going to blow your friend's cover. Now, if you're like me, you also relish the opportunity in order to fence more than one person at the same time. When you're talking about in an outdoor scenario, there are all kinds of ways that you can use the ground to your best effect, particularly if this is a forest battle. Now, I have been in countless situations where it was me versus 2, 3, 4, 5 people and more, where I used the terrain of the forest in order to break up their lines and turn what would have normally been multiple people fencing me at the same time into a series of one-on-one fights because of the fact that I was using the terrain to break up their line and forcing them to try and maneuver in relation to each other, but also in relation to all of these obstacles. Whereas I, as one person, was finding it very easy to maneuver myself, trying to fight as a team. A line of a team in a forest situation is not as easy as it might sound. I have on many occasions used that terrain to my best advantage and ended up defeating multiple people at a time, not because of the fact that I was just so great and so fast and so skillful that I was able to take them all on at one time. Quite the opposite, in fact. I used the terrain in order to break them up and turn it into just a series of 1 to 2 second bouts between me and one other person. Now, what that means also is that I'm taking advantage of the fact that in most of those situations, there's quite a disparity in the skill level between me and that person I was able to break away for that 1 or 2 second fight. But nonetheless, even if your skill level happens to be right around the same level as they are, it is still a much better advantage for you to end up facing them one-on-one as opposed to trying to engage them multiple swords at the same time. In an ideal situation, I would have video footage that I would be using in order to help illustrate all of these points. But as you may have already guessed, particularly when I'm talking about a forest battle scenario, it's a little difficult in order to find cameramen who can keep up with you even when they're only carrying a cell phone. It's really kind of difficult for them to be able to keep pace in that kind of a situation. But if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to reach out to me. I am more than happy to help you where I can. And if we ever should find ourselves at an SCA event somewhere, or we're even in the same room at a HEMA event sometime, hey, touch base with me. We will step off to the side and I will show you firsthand exactly what I was talking about in this, because as we all know, I'm really more of a show than tell kind of guy. And you guys as Patreon supporters, you are my first priority in helping you to maximize your potential and help you to become the best swordsman that you can become.